I have in the book some images of scribes from the ancient world sitting cross-legged, looking at their tablets, and when I squint, they look very much like my students sitting cross-legged in the library, looking at their tablets. The other form that's returned is scrolling, right? We are scrolling again, we are scrolling down our screens, even though the scroll, which had been so important, which Ezra had held up as sacred scripture, had been replaced by the Roman invention of the book.
Martin Puchner has accomplished an amazingly tricky task in this latest book. He has surveyed about 4,000 years worth of stories and selected 16 foundational texts. Each of these, for some reason or other, exceeds the norm to become a reference point for an entire culture. Puchner explains that these texts answer very fundamental questions in the same way that our genes document our biological inheritance. Where have we come from? Why are we here? And why here instead of another place in the globe? Puchner likens these essential stories to cultural DNA. Martin Puchner is a professor of English and comparative literature at Harvard and editor of the Norton Anthology of World Literature. He's read an awful lot of stories. In addition to being chair of Harvard's new program in theater, dance, and media, he teaches an online course to hundreds of thousands of students in 160 countries around the world. Good evening to Professor Puchner, and welcome.
So I'm going to take you on a romp through literary history, 4,000 years of it. And as with all stories, it's good to start the story of literature at the very beginning. Now, it's very hard to know what happened at the very beginning. It's often a kind of retrospective reconstruction. But here's a story that was told by Mesopotamian scribes in what's today Iraq about 4,000 years ago about how their ancestors invented writing. The first writing system emerged in Mesopotamia about 5,000 years ago. And this is how Mesopotamian scribes themselves told the story of that origin. The story is set in the town of Uruk, which is really one of the first urban spaces in human history. Urbanization was made possible by a new form of intensive agriculture that allowed for kind of concentration of people in one space. And this is what happened in Uruk. So the story is set in Uruk, and it imagines a king of Uruk hoping to subdue a rival king, the king of the mountain realm of Arata. So the king of Uruk sends a messenger to the king of Arata with a threat demanding allegiance. The messenger runs all the way up the mountains, delivers the message, but the king of Arata is not very impressed and sends the messenger back with a challenge. If the king of Uruk can meet the challenge, maybe then he will submit. The challenge is to transport grains in nets all the way up to the mountains. The king of Uruk thinks about this challenge. He has an idea. He takes grain and lets the grain sprout. And then he can put it in nets, and he gives it to the messenger, and he sends the messenger with the grain up to the mountains, says, here, I met your challenge, pledge your allegiance. But the king of Arata still has no mind to do that, and sends the messenger back with another challenge that is met, and another challenge, and the messenger has to run back and forth quite some distance, and we seem to be at an impasse. The king of Uruk, in the meantime, gets really angry because he has met 3 difficult challenges, and still the king, the mountain lord of Arata, is not submitting. So he goes on an incredibly long and angry rant. And at this point, the messenger standing next to him panics because he can't remember the long rant. And it's at this moment, according to the story, that the king of Uruk takes some clay, puts his rant, onto the clay tablet, gives the clay tablets to the messenger. The messenger runs up one more time to the mountains, presents the king of Arata with the clay tablets and says, here's the message. The king of Arata looks at the message, holds it to his ear, doesn't understand it, doesn't understand what's going on, can't understand how a clay tablet can hold language, And then in the face of his entire court, he submits to Uruk. So this is the story how these scribes imagined the invention of writing. It's a pretty self-serving story, and it's a story that captures the power they felt writing really had. It allowed speech to be projected across space from Uruk in the mountain plains up to the mountains. It imagines the power of this technology because the king of Arata is so impressed just by this technology that he acknowledges in some sense the superiority of this civilization that has developed writing. And a third thing is interesting, that at this point, the story about the invention of writing has nothing to do with literature. It's purely a kind of diplomatic message. It's the first text message, if you will, in human history. And it has to do with power politics, with relation to a rival. It's sent by an imperial scribe of some sort. The messenger has become a scribe. The king sends the written message. So, and this is in fact historically true. In Mesopotamia, where the first writing is developed, in the first couple of hundred years, writing is used primarily for bureaucratic purposes. This is one of the first states that give rise to a state bureaucracy that keeps track of economic transactions, that starts to tax people and keep track of tax records, and political messages such as the one captured by this story. So writing, in other words, is invented by accountants, and it has nothing to do with literature. It's only after several hundreds of years that one of these accountants, one of these tax collectors, decides to use this new technology of writing for a completely different purpose, and that is to write down a story. And that, for me, is really the moment when literature, namely written story, begins. It's the intersection of storytelling, which had, of course, been going on everywhere. Wherever humans had lived, they had told stories orally and transmitted them orally from generation to generation. But at this moment, this long oral storytelling tradition intersects with this new writing technology. And this is, for me, this is the definition of literature: storytelling plus writing technology. And that's, if you will, the big bang of literature. And everything that happens afterwards, the history of written stories, begins with this intersection. So once this intersection happens, the most important stories get written down in each culture. In Mesopotamia, that will be the first important story to be written down. The first, what I call foundational epic, is the Epic of Gilgamesh. And it's an epic that commemorates a legendary king of Uruk, the place where, according to the story with which I began, writing was invented for the first time. And it commemorates King Gilgamesh, who recreates the great city of Uruk. And I want you to imagine this as a city built out of clay. The Great Wall of Uruk is made out of clay bricks, and King Gilgamesh is presented as rebuilding that wall. The houses of Uruk in this first urban space are made of clay. Plumbing is made of clay. The food is transported from far afield into the city in clay plots. The potter's wheel is the first sort of sophisticated mechanical tool, really, that is used to produce these clay pots. There are even clay sickles with which some of the agricultural products are harvested. So it's a whole clay city that the Epic of Gilgamesh starts by describing to us. It even mentions the clay pits from which this precious material, not precious but ubiquitous, but useful, important material for Uruk is harvested. But of all the uses of clay in this clay-based civilization, the most important is the one that I just described, namely to use clay and to press words onto clay. This is the Mesopotamian writing system, the first writing system, to press marks into clay, and this becomes the material onto which the Epic of Gilgamesh is written. So a clay city that celebrates the writing, the clay-based cuneiform writing, and its great first story, the Epic of Gilgamesh, as the most important use to which clay has been put. Writing is very important, and it's front and center of this epic. Mesopotamian civilization, as captured in this epic, is very conscious that writing is one of its great achievements. And this is very much in contrast, for example, to other epics from the ancient world, especially the Homeric epics. The Homeric epics take place in an entirely oral culture. There is no writing either in the Iliad or in the Odyssey, with one small insignificant exception. It's an entirely oral culture, and in fact in the Odyssey, it's Odysseus himself, the hero, who sings part of the episodes, part of the story that's being told himself to the court. So that is a written epic that celebrates oral storytelling and does not talk about writing. The much earlier Epic of Gilgamesh is different. It really presents writing as a great cultural achievement of Mesopotamia and presents King Gilgamesh as a writer king who himself writes the story. And that, I think, captures just how important this culture deemed writing to be and how proud it was of this culture. So this is the first epic, but soon other writing cultures emerge, and something similar to what I have just described happens, namely writing enters a culture. It sometimes is primarily used first for accounting purposes, but very quickly now with these long foundational stories get written down, so more and more writing cultures develop these foundational epics like the Homeric epics and the Epic of Gilgamesh. And this is what I describe sort of the first stage in the first chapter in the story of literature, these foundational epics that tell its listeners and its readers who they are, where they came from. Sometimes they include creation myths of the creation of the world, and provide entire cultures with a sense of cultural cohesion. The Epic of Gilgamesh is read across a wide region, and the other epics are as well. So this is the first stage in the story of literature. The next stage, something interesting happens. And for me, the moment when the next stage is inaugurated takes place in Jerusalem. In Jerusalem, where Ezra, the scribe, has just led a group of exiled Jews from Babylonian exile back to the city of Jerusalem, which had been partially destroyed, and many of the Jews had been exiled. But now they are returning. Ezra the scribe is leading a group of returnees in order to rebuild the city walls, in order to rebuild the temple, and to reinstitute Judaism as a temple practice. But there's something else that Ezra brings with him from Babylonian exile. In Babylonian exile, the scriptures of these exiled people had become more and more important because they no longer had a king. There's no longer a temple for ritual practice. So the texts in which the stories of the Jews had been written down had become important in exile, and more stories had been added to them. And these stories now, Ezra the scribe, who had trained in Babylon, in the great Mesopotamian writing culture, is now bringing these texts back to Jerusalem. And then he does something important, and he plans it very carefully. He builds a stage, a wooden stage. He calls everyone together, and he takes the scrolls, the Torah scrolls, and he holds them up, and he demands that the assembled people bow before these scrolls and worship them as if they were a god. And at this moment in the story of literature, the idea of sacred scripture is invented. Of course, we are all very familiar with this idea of sacred scripture. especially here in this church. We are so familiar with it because that idea really caught on, to the extent that I think today it's almost impossible for us to even imagine what a religion without a sacred scripture would be. And that's not just true of the three so-called religions of the book, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, but also of Hinduism, of Buddhism. Really, all religions today are based almost all on some idea of sacred scripture, very familiar to us. But like all things, this idea that what once was a very mundane accounting technique, tax collection technique, if you will, in Mesopotamia, should become sacred, that some of these written stories should come to be seen as sacred stories, had to be invented. And for me, one moment where this idea was invented and really presented for the first time is in that moment when Ezra, who was exposed to the most sophisticated writing culture at the time in Babylon, returns and holds up the Torah scrolls and basically institutes the text as something even more important than the temple. And of course, that becomes hugely important. So this is, if you will, the second stage, the second chapter in the story of literature, the idea of sacred scripture. And I think since then we have been living in a world that has really been very fundamentally shaped by this idea of sacred scripture. The next stage in the story of literature takes a different turn. It's based on a whole pattern, on different kinds of what I call charismatic teachers that emerged in the ancient world within a few hundred years of each other in different writing-based cultures. These charismatic teachers live in writing cultures, but they have in common that they chose not to write. Among these teachers, I count the Buddha in India, Confucius in China, Socrates in Greece, and Jesus in the Near East. As I said, they live in what's at the time the most literate cultures of their time. They could write, but they chose not to. Instead, they insist on live, interactive teaching. They assemble students and followers around them, and they engage in questions and answers. They live with their students. They answer questions. They exchange ideas with their students. And it's power. These are powerful ideas, so powerful that students follow them, change their lives, because they all notice that there's something important happening around these charismatic teachers in India and China and Greece and the Middle East and in some other places. There are other such charismatic teachers. The teachings themselves are quite different from each other, but what they have in common is that these teachers could write, but chose not to. But sooner or later, the inevitable happens, and these teachers die. Some of them, like Confucius or the Buddha, die of natural causes. Others, like Socrates or Jesus, of a violent death. But either way, their students are now faced with an irretractable dilemma. They want to commemorate their teachers. They are convinced that their teachers are the most important figures and that their thoughts and deeds and words need to be somehow memorized and passed down. And yet these teachers refuse to write. And so there are oral traditions that start around these teachers, but sooner or later, some of these students do what their teachers deliberately didn't, namely they use writing and write down their teachers' words, and in some sense you could say betray their teachers in that they use writing where their teachers had deliberately chosen not to. Socrates, of these four teachers I mentioned, Socrates is the one who is most explicit in his rejection of writing. So as writing spreads and becomes more important, you have these skeptics and critics of the new technology. And Socrates in particular will say that one of the things that he dislikes about writing is that you can't ask a text follow-up questions. You can't ask a text questions and probe the way you can a speaker. He also worries that the more we trust this external memory device, we no longer have to know things ourselves. So we are sort of outsourcing an important cognitive function. So various kinds of arguments are against writing, but then the students write down their teachers' words sooner and later because they consider it so important and they want to use this powerful technology of writing to write them down. But what's interesting about it is they know, of course, that their teachers had avoided writing. So what they do is they channel that avoidance, that skepticism with respect to writing back into the texts they now produce. And the way they do it is by not writing the kinds of texts that I described earlier, for example, these foundational epics, or texts like the Hebrew Bible, but much more vivid dialogic texts that show teachers in live interactions with their students, that describe these teachers as they lived and acted. And the results, some are outright, in the case of Plato, the student of Socrates, he creates outright dialogues, almost like plays. So these texts are much more vivid, if you will, than the older scriptures or the foundational epics. And that's part of their power. It's part of their power and why this third type of literature, if you will, this literature produced by students of these charismatic teachers now becomes such a powerful new addition to the written world. And some of these texts are also very canny now in using the most important revolutions in writing technology. And I want to just spend a little bit more time with that because that's one of the through lines really of the book, how different writing technologies have shaped the written world. And that's that through line, that focus is very much conceived of based on an experience we all share today. Namely, we are really living in this unusual time when we are experiencing live, as it were, a true rare revolution in writing technologies, when profound changes happening around how we communicate with written words, who writes and for what purpose, and how we read and what kinds of stories get told in writing. And so one of the motivations for the book was to look back at these earlier moments when new writing technologies came along and transformed how we communicate with each other in writing. So these texts of these charismatic teachers now become some of the earliest adopters of new writing technologies. One text in particular I want to mention is the Diamond Sutra. It's one of the texts written by followers of the Buddha long after the master's death. And Buddhist monks transport this text from India to China, where it gets translated into Chinese. And it is in China that this text encounters two of the most important inventions in writing technology, namely paper and print, both invented first in China. And the earliest existing printed text in the world is the Diamond Sutra from 868, so long before Gutenberg invented, or we should really say reinvented, print in Northern Europe. The Diamond Sutra was printed in China and on paper. The reason why these new technologies are so important is because they radically lower the cost of producing literature. And if you lower the cost of literature, you allow more people entrance into the literary world, and therefore new kinds of stories to emerge, as well as older stories to become more prominent. And this is one of the patterns I detected by taking this bird's eye view of 400 years of literature, 4,000 years of literature. Namely that on the one hand, the most established canonical texts are often the early adopters of new writing technologies. The Buddhist sutra, the Diamond Sutra, is a good example. The same will happen several hundred years later when Gutenberg reinvents print for Northern Europe, when one of the first texts, the first long text he prints, is the Latin Bible. So these established canonical sacred texts or texts of master teachers are often the texts that are in the best position to profit from these great new technologies. And these are also often texts that their believers, their readers, want to use to proselytize, so they are invested in replicating these texts and distributing them and proselytizing with them. One reason why that print and paper, for example, are such excellent technologies for these texts. But as I said, the other effect of these new technologies is usually that more people can enter the literary world. That is, there are suddenly new readers and new writers, and that also means that there are new stories that get told. It's a kind of democratization, really, of the written world. And that happens whenever these new technologies come along. Happens in China with paper and print. And now paper gets adopted by the Arabic world next. There are very dramatic stories about how the Arabs had to extract the secret of paper making from Chinese prisoners of war. We don't know whether these stories are true, but they record how important the idea of papermaking, the technique of papermaking, was considered to be. And Baghdad becomes the center of papermaking in the Arabic world. And it's in Baghdad that a new form of popular literature emerges that, if you will, is the beginning of a fourth stage in the story of literature, namely popular storytelling, that now for the first time is written down. And the text for me that captures that best is a story collection from the Arabic world you all know, that we all grew up with, namely the Arabian Nights. The Arabian Nights is a very different kind of literature, yet again, from these earlier ones. It's a very loose story collections with hundreds of stories. The stories themselves come from far-flung places as far away as Persia and India and Greece, and these stories circulate on the Eurasian continent. But now that, thanks to paper, writing has become cheaper and more widely available, and new readerships, especially a rising merchant class, is interested in written stories, these different kinds of stories make it into writing. And the result is this marvelous story collection of the Arabian Nights. The earliest paper fragment from the Arabic world is a fragment from the wonderful framing story of the Arabian Nights. And the Arabian Nights is just one of many of these story collections. Story collections really start to dominate the world of writing for many hundreds of years, all the way to the Middle Ages. And it becomes a way of collecting different kinds of stories that different readers can now enjoy and participate in, stories that get retold. And these story collections are also dynamic in that new stories can be added to them. Our current version of the Arabian Nights really comes from the 18th century. So there are, over the hundreds of years, different stories were added to this framing story of Scheherazade and her sister and the king. And these framing stories become almost like storytelling machines, where you add new stories and you adapt them, and there are stories within stories. It's a real storytelling universe that's created. And one of the drivers, I would say, of that is paper. What's interesting about the Arabic world is they adopt paper to such great effect, but not print. These two technologies, both invented in China, separate. One travels to the Arabic world, and through the Arabic world and Arab-occupied Spain to Europe. The other, namely print, travels on the Silk Road through the Eurasian continent to Europe. And it is with Gutenberg in Northern Europe that these two inventions reconnect. And it's really that reconnection of paper and print that sets off the second great revolution in writing technologies, namely the print revolution in Northern Europe, so-called invented by Gutenberg, but really reinvented by Gutenberg, because Gutenberg was quite aware that there was some form of print that had happened in China. He was also lucky in that papermaking, the art of papermaking, had just arrived in Europe a few hundred years before, just in time so that his newly conceived printing press could really take off thanks to paper, because without a cheap writing surface. Without a cheap writing material, print would never have had the transformative effects it had in Northern Europe. It may be perhaps good to end this part of the story with the Gutenberg revolution, because there are two moments that are worth pointing out. And the one is the sort of better known part of the story, namely that after Gutenberg printed the Latin Bible, there was a kind of explosion of literacy. More people wanted to read the Bible, and that really triggered the Protestant Revolution, right? Because more people wanted to read, the Bible was translated into the languages of the people, into English. Martin Luther translated the Bible into German, and really much broader groups of people had access now for the first time to this sacred text. So that, in other words, it was partially the print revolution that starts a chain of events that leads right up to the Protestant Revolution, because Martin Luther really becomes expert at dominating this new world of print with his fantastically polemical and witty kind of writing. So that is maybe part of a story that you know, and I think it's a true story. But there's a story before that happens that I want to briefly talk about, and that for about 60 years, it did not look like print was going to lead to a weakening of the church at all. For the first 60 years, print and the church worked hand in glove. The first thing Gutenberg prints after reinventing the printing press is Indulgences. It was perfect for the printing press because these are one-page sheets of paper. You would leave off the name of the person who would buy the indulgence, and you could just print hundreds or thousands, in some cases tens of thousands of these indulgences, and it's basically like printing money. And this is exactly what the church did. The church loved the printing press and used it immediately, became its first client of Gutenberg, and used it immediately to print indulgences. And the second thing Gutenberg prints is, of course, the Latin Bible. Now, Gutenberg had some reason to worry whether the church would like that, because up to that point, devoted monks had devoted their lives to painstakingly copying the sacred scriptures in this elaborate method that promised salvation in the afterlife and was this kind of great meditative technique that many, many monks devoted their lives to. And here Gutenberg was coming with this new machine and proposing to do the work of monks much more cheaply, right? You would think that the church would be very skeptical of that. But in fact, it wasn't. The church loved Gutenberg and loved his printed Bible. Why? Because the church could now produce cheaper Bibles, and these were Bibles that would be sent to monasteries and churches. Also, the church loved the printing because it meant that all Bibles were now more or less error-free. There had been a lot of hand-wringing on the part of the church before that basically in no two churches was the same mass ever preached because of generations of errors of human scribes. So there's a real concern about that. And with print, of course, there can be printing mistakes, but the mistakes of generations of scribes that would multiply would be eliminated. And so print promised to solve a real important problem for the church. So for about 60 years, print and church worked hand in glove. And it was only after that golden period, so to speak, that the second effect, that popular effect of new writing technologies made themselves felt. And Martin Luther started to use the printing press in ways that neither Gutenberg nor the church had imagined possible, because the printing press had changed the way people read and wrote and how they interacted through writing. And since then, we have been basically living in what some call the Gutenberg Galaxy, namely a world shaped by the printing press. The first printing press in North America was right here in Cambridge because, of course, the Puritans developed here the most literate society on earth. And I talk about the inheritance of that kind of book reading and printing culture all the way to Benjamin Franklin, who was what I would call the first print entrepreneur, in that he created a whole network that included paper mills. Of course, he was by profession a printer. He developed newspapers and broadsheets and new forms of polemic. He even had control over the postal roads as Postmaster General, over which printed matter would be transported across the 13 colonies. And his greatest contribution to the American Revolution, I would say, was as a print entrepreneur. So this is essentially our world until recently, when a new revolution in writing technologies has been taking place all around it. And I won't make any predictions exactly what the effects of that will be, except that I think these two types of effects that happened earlier are also happening right now. Namely, on the one hand, a lot of the canonical literature is now much more widely available than ever before through such online platforms as Project Gutenberg or Internet Archive, right? So we really have now very easy access to the great store of world literature. And on the other hand, new forms of popular writing are emerging. And we're just at the beginning of this writing revolution, so that I'm sure there are many more will emerge. But I'll just mention, for example, fan fiction is a very new form of writing in which readers suddenly become active as writers. Or very specialized, hyper-specialized forms of romance that are published on Amazon and other websites. And of course, short forms, Twitter. Twitter reminds me very much of that first message sent by the angry king of Uruk. Sometimes when Trump is tweeting to King Jong-un, I'm thinking of that exchange between the king of Uruk and the king of Arata. So there is certainly an explosion of popular writing. More people are reading and writing than ever before, and that's just will have profound new effects, and new forms and genres of writing are clearly developing in that context. But not everything is new. I'm also struck that some of the new forms that are ushered in by our revolution harken back to much earlier forms. One of them is the tablet. Right? I started with the clay tablets on which the Epic of Gilgamesh was first written. And tablets had gone out of fashion for really thousands of years, replaced by the scroll and later by the book. And now, for the first time, we're writing on tablets again. I have in the book some images of scribes from the ancient world sitting cross-legged, looking at their tablets, and when I squint, they look very much like my students sitting cross-legged in the library looking at their tablets. The other form that's returned is scrolling, right? We are scrolling again. We are scrolling down our screens, even though the scroll, which had been so important, which Ezra had held up as sacred scripture, had been replaced by the Roman invention of the book that I haven't had time to talk much about, a very convenient format that's easy to transport, that's easy to flip through. But now, because computers encode text as continuous text, they don't divide naturally into pages, we are scrolling down our screens again. So a lot is new. And I think there will be new, and there already are new forms of storytelling that are developing, but some of these techniques also, in an interesting way, go back to much earlier forms of storytelling from the 4,000 years of literature. So this is the story of literature in 40 minutes, as I promised, and I think now we can move to the second part of the evening. Thank you.
Just before we open up to general questions, I had a couple of questions for you, Martin. You're very optimistic, it seems, about the future of writing, and I wish I were too. I'm not. But I don't think you can equate texting with literature, can you really? I mean, the sort of level of the kind of diminution of word use, getting by with cool, awesome, 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 exclamation, smiley face, smiley face.
Okay, so the smiley faces is another thing that's returned. Non-phonetic writing, right? It's iconic writing. It's like cuneiforms. Interesting that that's really taken off again. Compression. I'm not saying the average text or the average tweet is great literature. But so one of the episodes from the book is what I think is the first great novel in world literature, which is The Tale of Genji, written at the court of Japan about 1,000 years ago, written by a lady in waiting, Murasaki Shikibu, a wonderful and moving story. She basically had to teach herself literature secretly, because as a woman she didn't have access to literature, and then turned that knowledge, that self-acquired knowledge, and her position at court into the first great novel with really very psychologically acute, describing in great detail that court society. And what's central in that picture, in that novel, is that this court society uses for everyday forms of communication these short waka poems. They're just 2 lines. And they're not necessarily great art. Some of them are great art, but they are that's the form of communication, and you send them back and forth. Hundreds of such short poems / text messages were exchanged at court. And the form of interaction was very similar. It mattered how long you waited before you responded. There was a clear style that emerged in this communication. Certain things would be said, certain things would be unsaid. Anyway, again, when I squint, I see a society depicted in this first novel that uses a form of very quick text messages back and forth, basically to communicate and conduct everything from love affairs to politics. So again, this is not necessarily reason to be optimistic, I suppose, but I think it's just a reminder that compression and short vernacular forms of short written expressions can do double duty as communications and very ephemeral and nothing important about it, but also lead to a form of art. And I think there are some people who use Twitter and text messages who figure out that you can turn it into a particular style. And again,
Trump certainly has.
Well, it's interesting. Well, he has to some extent, of course, but it will be very interesting how future presidents use Twitter. Of course, now we think of Trump-style use of Twitter as the only possible one, and it may well turn out to be typical, but maybe other presidents will use it in a slightly different form. We are really just at the beginning of it, and I think there are maybe possibilities you can't quite imagine.
Another question. Speaking the truth, that the telling of a story, which is so important and integral to so many cultures, I've been very impressed by the resurrection of oral storytelling that's taking place with the moth and live situations where people are present to hear people's stories being told. Yes. It seems like we're hungering for that.
Yeah. I agree, and it's one of the things that surprised me about the process of researching and thinking about and writing this book. I imagined that the role of oral storytelling would be important, certainly in the beginning of the book at this moment of intersection, but what I didn't quite expect, but what turned out to be the case, that the importance of oral storytelling continued all the way to the very present. One example is the Epoch of Sundiata, which is this great West African epic that commemorates the founding of a kingdom in Western Africa in the late Middle Ages and was transmitted orally for hundreds of years and written down in its current and the most important current form only in the late 20th century. So you realize that this transition that we may associate with Mesopotamia or with Greece of Homer is still happening all around us, and that oral storytelling and writing technologies are as intertwined as at they were at the beginning, and it's not that the one is replacing the other at all. And these charismatic teachers who avoid writing altogether are, again, are another example of that. So you're absolutely right. And this is partially, again, of course, a story of maybe new technologies. So the Epoch of Sundiata was actually not literally written down. It was recorded with a tape recorder in the 90s and then transcribed and turned into writing. And that turning an oral story into writing is a really interesting and very dramatic and difficult process. So I agree. I think oral storytelling continues to evolve alongside writing in really fascinating ways, sometimes driven by these technologies, sometimes as reactions against it, because you realize something is being lost. Yeah.
If you'd like to come up to the microphone, we can take questions, please.
How can we, as people, know what is truth and what is not?
Yeah, no, it's an important question. It's important now than ever. And I think one thing I realized from looking at this long 4,000 years of literature and written stories and how important different writing technologies are, is like all powerful tools. They can be used for good or ill, right? It's not necessarily good. I sometimes had, I was writing the story of literature and of these writing revolutions, and I sometimes got caught up in the idea that they were getting better and better, and more people were able to participate in it. But of course, with each of these revolutions, more things were written. There was, more possibilities for falsehood, if you will, for fake news, for misinformation. And this is why some of the charismatic teachers I talked about, like Socrates, were very skeptical of writing of any sort. So I think that you are absolutely right, that it is something that the more powerful and widespread writing becomes, and it is becoming more widespread because more people can publish than ever before, the more urgent this question becomes. Thank you very much.
No, thank you.
What do you think of Socrates' concern that external memory devices like Google constrain or limit our knowledge? I mean, he didn't put it that way, but I guess he asked that fundamental question. And also, what do you think of folk songs as sung by Bob Dylan as exquisite forms of literature?
Yeah, well, to start with the thank you for both questions and start with the second, I was very happy when the Nobel Prize Committee in its wisdom decided that Bob Dylan was literature, and I think that precisely because of that intersection of oral storytelling and singing and literature that we somehow thought we had left behind was put front and center even of the Swedish Academy, the body that gives the Nobel Prize. About Socrates, I thought a lot about it. I don't have a simple answer because it's so paradoxical that the only reason why we even know about Socrates' arguments against writing is because his student Plato chose to write them down. So, in some sense, even though I was, throughout writing this book, fascinated by oral storytelling and how it emerged and was intertwined, I nevertheless somehow always found myself, whether I wanted or not, taking the side of writing, including in this moment when Socrates, but also Jesus and the Buddha and Confucius, they refused to write, but even though I'd said that their students betrayed their teachers, and to some extent they did, I'm glad they did. I'm glad they did, because otherwise we wouldn't be here debating it. So that would be one answer. That in the end, as valid as I find these questions, as valid as I find the idea of live teaching. I mean, this is what we're doing right now. You can look at it later on video, but there's something important that we are here all together in a room and interacting and asking questions. All of these things you can't really do of a text. So you could say that what we are doing right now confirms Socrates' choice or preference for teaching and for live interaction rather than just for texts. But writing is powerful, as we just said in connection to the earlier question. And so it's difficult to give up on something that's so powerful, and I personally wouldn't want to do it.
I'm looking forward to reading your book as well. You've documented 4,000 years of literature. How do you see today's contemporary writing? I mean, I think Dickens and Tolstoy and Joyce and all these great writers were chroniclers of the time, and they could tell us so much about a society. Looking at today, who are the writers that are equal to that? And Gore Vidal spoke about music being, the state of music could tell you about the state of a culture. And how can you tell about our culture now through arts and literature? Because when I look at universities, I don't think art and literature is a priority for many young people. It's law, it's criminal justice, and the arts are under great threat, I believe, in this country today.
They are, in many ways. It's true. Student enrollment, student interest in literature courses has definitely gone down, especially since the Great Recession. And we are all struggling, I think, to convey to this generation of students who grew up with smartphones and apps, to convey to them the power and importance of literature. I mean, this is, in the end, I think, the deepest motivation for my book. I didn't want to write a book that says, oh, the young people don't care about literature anymore, but I thought, I just have to make literature look as enticing and important as I possibly can, and maybe that will convince someone, and in my teaching and including the online courses as well. But to what extent I will succeed with that, I don't know. So there is, of course, a real worry that especially these long, you mentioned Tolstoy and some of these Dickens, these great 19th century novelists who wrote long novels, how can we make that understandable to students? One way to do it, one way I tried to do it, is that actually many of these 19th century novelists, especially Dickens, wrote in serial form, in forms that is very similar to television series, because they were published week after week in newspapers, and only after they had run their course in this serial publication, where they combined and collected in these typical Victorian triple-deckers, and then sold as books, and then you could, I suppose, binge read them, which is what we now do with novels. While they were being published, you had to read them in installments. So there too is an older form of publication that is returning in different forms today. But it is a challenge, and I don't know that I have a good answer for especially how this generation of students, how to convey to them the importance of literature. It's a challenge. But I think trying to explain a little bit the technological prehistory, and that what they are doing on their iPhones, what they do when they read something on the internet, when they leave a book review on Amazon, when they post something on a blog, that is in some ways, well, it's not Tolstoy. Coming back also to your question, it is a form of written communication that is part of the partially technological story that gave rise, for example, to the novel. Novel, a form, even though it precedes print, really is very much connected to the age of print. And there's a good question whether the novel, as we know it, will be the dominant genre of the electronic publication era in which we are entering. Maybe not. Each of these chapters in the story of literature is sort of dominated by one genre, and the one for the age of print is the novel. And I think that probably a new form of written storytelling will emerge that will be different from Tolstoy. and Dickens. But what it will be and whether it will be any good, I don't know.
I'm curious, though, why it is you focus on literature and not consciousness. In other words, it seems to me that literature is a kind of subset of a bigger issue in the human enterprise. And we can talk about pre-literate, literate, and many start talking now about post-literate societies.
Yeah, right.
So in a sense, literature might be a phase in the human enterprise, and we may be coming again to a period of symbology that doesn't have to do with linear text.
With written stories.
And in this respect, I thought, particularly the tablets you're referring to, what we're looking at is icons, and we're tapping icons, right? It's not as if we're thinking in linear terms anymore, and literature may not be the way to go at it. In this respect, I was curious about, I haven't read the book, obviously, but I've got to do it now. Obviously, it's very intriguing, because it seems to me when you speak of literature, you speak a lot about what emerged in those cultures that developed linear, from linear B right on, or from the cuneiform tablet, that developed thinking as an aspect of narrative. Now, narrative is much bigger than storytelling. And it may be that which we're yearning for when we get back to oral societies and storytelling on the stage, like we're seeing revived now. And the problem is that narrative transcends both literary moment and the iconographic. In fact, it may be the icons that carry narrative much more quickly, quick symbols. Like it doesn't take a lot of explanation to say what a swastika means, right? Or a cross, or a crescent, right? They're symbols. They imply a narrative, and it's the narrative that attracts people to them, not the literature. And I'd like to see, in a sense, you resituate your storytelling within the problem of narrative.
Okay. No, this is very rich and interesting sets of thoughts. So first, I would say that what I call storytelling may be closer to your understanding of narrative in that it doesn't always have to be linear. I would say especially some of these old texts, the Old Testament is a good example. They are narrative, they're stories in the Old Testament, but it's a very, in some sense, fragmented or cobbled together text with many different layers. Many people have commented on it, and people have tried to reconstruct different authors from different times. So the Old Testament is in a particularly, non-linear text. It's a compendium, exactly. It's a library. It's a collection. And I mentioned the Arabian Nights with its very labyrinthine structure and stories within stories, and then you arrive. So there are very many examples within the world I talk about of some of these much more discontinuous kind of narratives, not just linear narratives that are perhaps more closely associated with the novel or with a kind of classical novel. But what I found interesting once I looked at these 4,000 years of literature, really how late, relatively late, the novel starts to dominate. How late also, for example, another figure that we find such a natural part of the literary world, namely the author. How late the author emerges. All these early texts I talked about, none of them are associated with authors. They are collected by scribes and edited and interwoven, which is in part why many of them aren't really linear, like Tolstoy, for example, or Dickens. And to come to your question about the icons that we press to, I'll return to a brief remark I made to you and the icons, because it's very interesting that it is a return to some extent to these phonetic writing systems that are logographic, that are iconic, that have a pictorial quality that can travel across languages. This is the great advantage. I mean, the alphabet was a huge invention. I didn't get to talk about it. It makes reading and writing so much more easier because all you need to know is about 25 signs. The disadvantage is that it only works with one language, whereas icons can work across language, right? You can communicate with someone in China using smiley faces and icons without sharing a common language. And so using those is a really interesting way of creating some kind of lingua franca, a common language of the internet. So I would consider that part of this written world that I describe, although it's a different form of writing with icons rather than, let's say, a phonetic alphabet. And what form of storytelling or narrative, to use your term, will emerge from that, I think will be very interesting to see.
So I was curious in your research, I heard about a lot of stories from the Middle East, I heard about Asia, I heard about Europe. I was curious about, in 4,000 years of storytelling, what other cultures you explored and what other parts of the world?
Yeah, well, many parts. Thank you for that question. One of the texts that I also like to talk about that I find fascinating is the Popul Vuh, the Mayan epic. One of the things that is great about it is that the Mayans developed the only confirmed independent writing culture in the world, because all the other writing cultures from China to the Middle East are part of the Eurasian continent. And it's possible, we don't know whether they were independent inventions of writing. It is possible, but that the idea of writing as it emerged in Mesopotamia traveled to these other places. But we know that the Americas did not have contact with Eurasia for the couple of thousand years when writing first developed in Eurasia. So we know that writing was invented at least twice. And in the Americas, it's primarily the Mayans who developed the most elaborate form of writing. And it's almost like an experiment to see whether the same thing would happen over again that happened in Eurasia, and it did. So there's a scribal culture, there's a sacred text, the Popul Vuh, wonderful creation myth. So I love it because of that unique quality that it's the only completely independent writing tradition. And also because it's another of these great stories of survival of some of the texts. That's something I didn't get to talk very much, because when the Spaniards came, they very quickly realized that the Mayan writing culture was a sort of center of resistance especially to conversion. So the Spaniards started to burn all the Mayan books. And Mayan scribes realized that in order to preserve the Popul Vuh, they needed to go underground. But they realized something else. They thought ahead, and they realized that the Mayan glyphs, their writing system, would also be wiped out, and that no one would be able to read it anymore. So what they did is they transliterated the Popul Vuh into the writing system of the victors, namely the Latin alphabet. And that's what they did, and that's how they preserved the Popul Vuh. So that is just one other, there are many others, but that is another one that I care a lot about, and that I think people don't quite recognize what a unique, independent, fascinating text that is.
Thank you so much. I'm a junior at Bowdoin College, and I'm an English major, so I don't need to be sold on the power of the written word.
Rests
I'm already there.
on your shoulders.
But my question is, because it's so difficult to discern between what is history and what is fiction, whatever else, like certainly in the case of the Buddha and the Bible, and then that times 4,000 years, where do you even start to look for the seams to try and develop a unified understanding of our literary and cultural history?
Because of the difficulty of this distinguishing between fact and fiction, you're saying? Yeah, well, it's interesting that distinction, fact and fiction, and that certain kinds of literature is fiction and other kinds of literature is what we now call nonfiction, that's a very recent distinction. Especially in the ancient world and beyond it, no one asked whether the Epoch of Gilgamesh is fact or fiction. It was a story that a whole culture was built on, and that became an important sort of guiding principle beyond the question of whether it was factual, the question whether it's fact or fiction, whether there was once a king called Gilgamesh who really rebuilt the wall of Uruk, wasn't really what was most important about this text. And that, I mean, there are huge divisions about how to interpret religious texts, sacred scripture, but I think there are, it's always a question of how we read texts, and there are different practices, obviously, of how to read different kinds of texts. So I'm not sure I fully am answering your question, but what is interesting, if you take sort of this long view of literature and written stories, that this fact-fiction distinction happens quite late. And I think for me, what was interesting is actually to break out of that to some extent and really focus on written stories, no matter whether these written stories were what we would expect today to find in a fiction bookshelf in a bookstore down at the Harvard bookstore, or in the shelf for religious texts or political texts. I have a chapter on the Declaration of Independence, which is another text that tells a story and becomes really a foundational text for an entire culture. So this is the written storytelling dynamic I'm after. The fact-fiction one is part of that story, but a relatively late one, which doesn't mean that it's not important. And certainly I, as someone who was telling the story of literature, my book is a what we might call nonfiction book, even though it contains a lot of stories. So it is an important distinction today, but it's a relatively recent one.
Thank you, Professor Puchner, for a very interesting talk. I found the way you parse the development of stories in writing very thought-provoking. And I'd like to just make a comment. I feel that you brought into relief for me the importance of writing in the history of human thought. And in particular, it's interesting to me that in the moment we seem to be in a kind of explosion of writing of all kinds. Right. It's true that your basic texting of two high school kids who say, sup, and eating pizza, ha, ha, ha. I mean, that may be anything from irritating to boring to, yet I've been astounded in my years of teaching at how the love of writing, of wanting to write, rather than speak face to face, we put a judgment on that that's negative, and yet kids want to write. They want to write to each other. They'll write to each other if they're in the same room. And so that seems to me to be, I'm not saying it's correlative, it occurs together with an explosion of writing, and I'm not saying there's a causal relationship, but it is interesting, that, for instance, that a huge number of new writers are writing their memoirs. People want to tell their stories. Right. And they tell them in everything from a loose prose poem to a carefully structured novel. I was brought up on writing as a craft, on Flaubert and Elizabeth Bishop and all these people who worked language carefully and for a long time before they would make it public. And yet I am interested that that narrows down the number of people who have access to writing their stories.
Yeah.
And so there is a kind of democratization going on, and I feel it's too early to judge it. I understand your reservations. Believe me, I taught freshmen writing. I do understand. But I think it's too early to really understand what the future of emailing will be, what the future of texting will be. Thank you.
I feel like that question was more for you.
You raised a point about emailing. You were concerned about it in the book. You said that the technology might not endure.
Well, I think it's already incredibly outdated. I mean, none of the young people would use, emailing is becoming as as archaic as writing a letter by hand almost. I mean, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but I think, I mean, you know, the obsolescence of these different, I mean, it's happening so fast. And the point about obsolescence is actually a really important one that has to do with storing and preserving stories. I write quite a bit about different kinds of libraries and how they were destroyed and how texts survived or barely survived and didn't survive. And it's a huge, so we think, of course, today the cost of storage is nearing zero, that we live in we have the extreme luxury of being able to preserve everything at very low cost. But that's not quite true because of technological change, that actually the formats are changing so much that librarians say the best way to make sure that something endures is actually to print it out on paper, because we don't know whether the old formats will be, you know, readable, and we can within all our lifetime, this has already happened. So the questions of obsolescence, in this case, not so much forms of writing, but just really memory devices, is a big one. So we haven't really solved the question of preservation. It's a really live issue and of concern. Though, you know, I'm spending the year at the New York Public Library, they now talk about how when they get the estate of writers, they print out emails, and that becomes part of the literary record, of course. Yeah.
I'm glad you brought up the question of obsolescence, because it leads right to my question, and that is, as you look back on 4,000 years and try to make sense of the history of literature, one of the intersection with technology is one of the things you talked a lot about. But what about what was lost? Why do some things survive and others not? And how do we know whether we've lost? I mean, when we have a gigantic archive of printed out emails saying, you know, thanks for dinner, will we not lose things the way we lost cuneiform tablets that turned into bricks somehow?
Right. Yeah. No, thank you for this question. And it was one that was on my mind a lot as I was writing the book. If there's one lesson I took away from this history, is that really the only way to guarantee the survival of a text is to make it matter to each generation. What we don't use, we tend to lose. And really most of the texts that made it to our present from the ancient world are texts that, like the Bible, that were used in different ways and in different forms, but continuously by someone. Because a culture, we need to, even today, we need to invest attention and capital into the preservation of a text. It takes attention, and the only way to do it is to make it matter to each generation. There are a few examples of texts that are completely lost and that get rediscovered, and the Epoch of Gilgamesh is an example. I talk about some of the libraries that get burned down, like the Library of Alexandria, and we lost so much literature through that. And it looked like that was going to happen also with the library of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, who collected the tablets on which the Epic of Gilgamesh was written. The library burned down. But fortunately, the Epic of Gilgamesh, as you also mentioned, was written on clay. And as we all know, when clay gets burned, it does not burn up, it gets hardened. It's like it was burned in a kiln. And this is why these hardened clay tablets, buried under rubble, were able to survive for 2,000 years. And we didn't even know that the Epic of Gilgamesh existed because it was never transliterated into the newer, mostly alphabetic writing systems. So, and it was rediscovered. So there are some stories of rediscovery, and we don't know how many else there will be. So we may well rediscover other texts like the Epic of Gilgamesh or the Popul Vuh. But for the most part, it is, as you say, a story of a loss, and we lost so much. We preserve mostly what we use. And you know, even today, libraries are throwing out books that don't get recalled and that don't show up on their records anymore. So, of course, the other thing is that you mentioned with the emails is that something might get lost because there's so much of it, right? And that of course, is one of the challenges for us. And the solutions have then more to do with search algorithms, right? That's how we make our ways through huge amounts of writing, but also education and other forms of filters. We need filters, and of course we are getting quite good at filtering. Whether it's the right forms of filtering is another way. So there's a preservation and keeping things from disappearing altogether, and then there's the question of keeping what's important in a sea of writing that's increasing at a frantic speed. That I think is the main challenge for us. Yeah.
Well, I think that was an amazing talk. We all learned a tremendous amount. Thank you very much, Professor Puchner.
Of course, we know about the Secret Six. Was the group of abolitionists in Concord, in Boston, in New York, who gave him the money and the weapons specifically for Harper's Ferry. So we know of at least 6 guys that supported him. But as for in theory, a lot of people thought it might have been a good idea. But again, when he was captured, a lot of abolitionists kind of turned their back on him and said, I wasn't involved. Of the Secret Six, 5 of them either disavowed dealing with Brown or they left the country. Only one of the Secret Six stayed in Worcester, Thomas Wentworth Higginson. He stayed in Worcester and said, okay, you want to get me? Come get me. He was the only one that stood by Brown physically and intellectually and said, yeah, I gave him money. What are you going to do about it? All the others kind of went away and hid for a while.